There's a strange thing that happens when you stop pouring yourself into everyone else and quietly turn your attention inward. People around you start to panic. They won't call it panic, they'll call it concern. They'll say you've changed, that something seems off, that you're being selfish. And for a while, their reactions will almost convince you to go back to the old way. Because the old way kept everyone comfortable. Everyone except you. Jung noticed this pattern over and over in his work with patients who had spent their entire lives oriented outward. People who knew everyone else's emotional temperature but couldn't tell you what they themselves actually wanted. People who had become so skilled at reading rooms, managing moods, and anticipating needs that they'd essentially vacated their own inner life. And when these patients finally turned inward, when something in them broke open or burned out enough that they had no choice, Jung watched a transformation unfold that disturbed him. Because the process of focusing on yourself, genuinely and fully, dismantles your life before it rebuilds it. And almost nobody warns you about the dismantling part. Today I'm going to walk you through what Jung discovered about what actually happens when someone stops abandoning themselves to take care of everyone else. Why it triggers so much resistance, both in you and in the people around you. What changes psychologically when you reclaim your own attention, and why the guilt you'll feel in the process is one of the most important signals that you're finally doing something right. Jung spent a significant part of his career studying people he described as psychologically absent from their own lives. These were often the kindest, most generous, most emotionally attuned people in any room. Therapists loved them because they were insightful about others. Friends relied on them because they always showed up. Families depended on them because they carried emotional weight no one else would touch. But when Jung looked closer, he saw something underneath all that generosity that troubled him. These people weren't giving from fullness. They were giving from absence. They had learned, usually very early in life, that their value came from what they provided to others. The child who kept the peace between warring parents. The sibling who absorbed everyone's anxiety so the household could function. The friend who became the unofficial therapist at age 12 because nobody else in their world was stable enough to hold that role. These children grew into adults who oriented their entire existence around other people's needs, and they did it so seamlessly, so naturally, that they genuinely believed this was just who they were. Jung recognized something crucial here. He saw that what looked like extraordinary empathy often functioned as a sophisticated form of self-abandonment. The person wasn't choosing to focus on others out of abundance. They were fleeing from themselves, because at some point in their development, they learned that focusing on their own needs was dangerous, unwelcome, or pointless. The child whose emotions were dismissed learns to dismiss them on their own. The child whose needs were treated as burdens learns to treat their own needs as burdens. And eventually, the turning outward becomes so automatic that the person forgets there was ever an inward to return to. So what happens when that person finally stops? When they hit a wall, through exhaustion, through betrayal, through a crisis that forces them to sit still, and they find themselves face to face with the interior life they've been running from for decades. The first thing that happens is emptiness, and this is where most people get scared and retreat back to old patterns. Because when you've spent your whole life focused on everyone else, turning inward feels like walking into a room you haven't entered in years. The furniture is covered, the air is stale, you don't recognize the place, and the silence, the absence of someone else's needs pulling at your attention, feels unbearable at first. Jung described this phase as a confrontation with the unlived life. All the desires you suppressed, the interests you abandoned, the parts of yourself you sacrificed to be useful to others, they're still in that room, waiting. But they've been neglected so long that they don't announce themselves with enthusiasm. They show up as a vague ache, a restlessness you can't name, a feeling that something is missing without any clarity about what that something is. Most people interpret this emptiness as proof that they're broken. They think, see, there's nothing inside me. I need to go back to helping others because at least that gives me purpose. And this is exactly the trap Jung warned about. The emptiness isn't absence of self. It's the space where the self has been waiting to be reclaimed. But you have to tolerate the discomfort of that space before anything can grow in it. You have to stay in the room even when every instinct tells you to leave and go check on someone else. The second thing that happens, and this one catches people completely off guard, is guilt. Massive, irrational, suffocating guilt. You start paying attention to your own needs and immediately feel like you're committing a crime. You say no to something you would have said yes to, and your body floods with shame. You spend a Saturday doing what you actually want instead of what someone else needs. And you can't enjoy it because a voice in your head keeps whispering that you're being selfish. Jung understood where this guilt came from. It's not moral guilt, the kind you feel when you've genuinely done something wrong. It's programmed guilt. It was installed in you during childhood, usually by a family system that needed you to be selfless in order to function. When the family's emotional survival depends on one member constantly giving, that member gets trained to feel guilty anytime they stop. The guilt is a leash. It yanks you back into service every time you try to walk away. And here's what makes this so insidious. The guilt feels real. It feels like your conscience. It mimics the voice of morality so perfectly that you genuinely believe you're doing something wrong by focusing on yourself. Jung was clear that this guilt had to be walked through, not around. You don't reason your way out of programmed guilt. You feel it, recognize where it came from, and keep doing the thing that triggered it anyway, over and over, until the guilt loses its grip. This is the part where your relationships start to shift. Because when you stop being endlessly available, the people who relied on your availability get uncomfortable. Some of them will express this directly. They'll tell you you've changed, you're being cold, you're abandoning them. Others will express it through passive aggression, guilt trips, or sudden crises that require your immediate attention. And some will simply disappear, because the only thing connecting you was your willingness to give and their willingness to take. Jung would have called this the revealing of the relational shadow. When you change your behavior, you expose the actual foundation of every relationship in your life. Relationships built on genuine mutual care will survive your transformation. They'll adapt, even if there's friction during the adjustment. But relationships built on your self-sacrifice will collapse, because you've removed the only thing holding them together. This collapse is painful. Watching people you love struggle with the new version of you, watching some of them choose to leave rather than relate to you as a whole person instead of a service provider, that hollows you out in ways you don't expect. You start questioning whether you made the right choice. Maybe you were better off just keeping everyone happy. Maybe the old way was easier. And it was easier. Jung never pretended otherwise. Living for other people is easier than living for yourself in one very specific way. It gives you a clear purpose that requires no self-reflection. When your entire identity is organized around being needed, you never have to ask the terrifying question of who you are when no one needs you. You never have to sit with the uncertainty of your own desires, your own direction, your own unlived potential. You just respond to the next person's crisis, and that response becomes your meaning. Focusing on yourself strips that easy meaning away, and what replaces it takes time to emerge. This is the part of the process that demands the most patience, the in-between, where the old identity has crumbled and the new one hasn't fully formed yet. You're no longer the person who drops everything for everyone, but you don't yet know who you are instead. Jung called this a liminal state, a psychological threshold. You're between identities, and that space is disorienting. But something is happening in that disorientation, even when you can't feel it. Jung observed that patients in this liminal space were undergoing what he called individuation, the process of becoming psychologically whole. When you stop defining yourself through other people's needs, your own psyche starts sending up material that's been buried for years. Dreams become more vivid. Old memories surface. Emotions you've suppressed start making themselves known, sometimes at inconvenient times, sometimes with an intensity that frightens you. This is the unlived life demanding attention. The creative impulses you set aside, the anger you swallowed, the desires you told yourself were unreasonable, the parts of your personality that didn't fit the role of caretaker, the fierce parts, the ambitious parts, the parts that want something for themselves without apology. They've been locked away, and now that you finally turned inward, they're rattling the door. If you've been sitting with any of this, the guilt, the emptiness, the slow unraveling of who you thought you were, and you're looking for a way to move through it with some structure, our guide, True Self-Discovery, offers 24 reflection exercises rooted in Jung's work. It's built for exactly this moment, when you've turned inward and need something to help you navigate what you find there. Click below to get True Self-Discovery, and let's keep going. Jung noticed that people in this phase of focusing on themselves often experienced what he described as the return of the shadow. The shadow, in Jung's framework, contains everything you've rejected about yourself, every quality you decided was unacceptable, every emotion you learned to suppress, every impulse you buried because it didn't fit the version of you that other people needed. For people who've spent their lives as caretakers, the shadow often contains selfishness. Real, unapologetic selfishness. The capacity to say, I want this for me and I don't care if it inconveniences you. The ability to prioritize themselves without constructing an elaborate justification. The willingness to take up space without first making sure everyone else has enough room. Now, the word selfishness probably triggered something in you just now. That's the programming. Because for people who've been trained to give endlessly, any movement towards self-interest gets labeled as selfish by the internal voice that was installed to keep you in service. But Jung understood that what gets called selfishness in these cases is usually just basic self-regard, the ordinary, healthy capacity to treat your own needs as real and legitimate. The shadow integration work here is learning to distinguish between genuine selfishness, exploiting others for personal gain, and the healthy self-focus you've been starved of your entire life. They feel identical when you first start practicing them. Saying, I need time alone, feels as transgressive as stealing, because your nervous system has been conditioned to treat self-care as self-indulgence. But they're fundamentally different, and learning to tell them apart is one of the most important psychological skills you'll ever develop. As you move deeper into this process, weeks, months, sometimes longer, something begins to shift that's harder to articulate. The emptiness that terrified you at the beginning starts to feel different. It stops feeling like absence and starts feeling like space, room to think, room to feel your own feelings without immediately translating them into someone else's experience, room to ask yourself what you actually want and sit with the answer, even if the answer is, I don't know yet. Jung described this shift as the ego moving from the center of the personality to its proper place. When you live for others, your ego is structured around their approval. Your sense of self depends on being needed, being helpful, being the person everyone turns to. That ego structure is fragile because it requires constant external validation. One person's disappointment can shatter your entire sense of worth. When you focus on yourself, that ego structure dissolves, which is why it feels like dying at first. But what emerges in its place is something more grounded. Your sense of self starts anchoring to internal experience rather than external response. You begin knowing what you feel because you feel it, not because someone else's reaction confirmed it. You start making choices based on what aligns with your actual values rather than what keeps the peace. This is individuation in practice. And Jung observed that it changed people in ways that were visible from the outside. Their posture shifted, their voice changed, literally. People who had spent years speaking in soft, accommodating tones developed a steadiness in their voice that others found startling. They stopped over-explaining their decisions. They stopped apologizing for having needs. They didn't become aggressive or unkind. They became present in a way they'd never been before. And here's something Jung found fascinating. When someone who's been selfless their entire life finally develops genuine self-focus, their capacity for real connection actually deepens. This seems paradoxical. You'd think that focusing on yourself would make you less available to others. But the opposite happens, because you're no longer connecting from depletion. You're no longer showing up to relationships as a hollow vessel hoping to be filled through usefulness. You're bringing an actual self to the relationship, someone with desires, boundaries, preferences, opinions. And that fullness makes genuine intimacy possible for the first time. The relationships you build after this shift look completely different from the ones you had before. They're quieter, less dramatic, less built on crisis and rescue. You stop being drawn to people who need saving and start being drawn to people who can actually meet you. You find yourself less interested in someone's potential and more interested in their reality. You choose people who show up consistently rather than people who need you desperately. This recalibration of relationship patterns is one of the most concrete signs that the inner work is taking hold. Jung would have pointed out that your external relationships always mirror your internal relationship with yourself. When you abandon yourself, you attract people who'll abandon you, or people who need you to abandon yourself for them. When you show up for yourself, you start attracting people who can show up for you. The external world reorganizes around the internal shift. But I want to be honest about something. This process takes longer than anyone tells you, and it's lonelier than you expect. The period between letting go of the old self and fully inhabiting the new one can stretch for months, sometimes years. There will be days when you feel like you've made a terrible mistake, when the guilt resurfaces, when the isolation weighs on you, when you miss the simplicity of just being useful to someone. Those days don't mean you're failing. They mean you're in the middle of something that hasn't finished yet. Jung himself went through a period of intense inner work that lasted years, a period where he withdrew from many of his external obligations to explore his own psyche. He later described it as the most important period of his life, but he also acknowledged it was the most difficult. He understood from personal experience that the path inward is not a comfortable retreat from the world. It's a confrontation with everything you've avoided, dressed up, and performed around for as long as you can remember. One of the things you'll confront is your own anger. And this is where the process gets really uncomfortable for people who've been caretakers. Because underneath years of selflessness, there's usually a reservoir of rage that's been building since childhood. Rage at the people who took your giving for granted. Rage at the system that trained you to erase yourself. Rage at yourself for participating in it for so long. This anger surfaces during the focusing inward process, and it can feel overwhelming because you've spent a lifetime learning to suppress it. Jung considered this anger essential. He saw it as the psyche's way of reasserting its own boundaries, a signal that the self is waking up and recognizing how much has been taken from it. The anger isn't the problem. The problem was the system that required you to be angry and pretend you weren't. Feeling the anger, letting it exist without acting on it destructively, is part of the reclamation. It's the self saying, "This matters, I matter, and I'm done pretending otherwise." After the anger, something gentler comes. And this is what Jung found most remarkable about the people who stayed with the process long enough. They developed a quality he associated with psychological maturity, a quiet, grounded compassion that looked nothing like their previous caretaking. Their old compassion was anxious, driven by fear of conflict and abandonment. Their new compassion came from a completely different place. It was steady, boundaried, given freely because it was chosen, not because it was compulsive. These people could still hold space for others. They could still listen, still care, still show up in meaningful ways. But they did it without disappearing in the process. They maintained their own center while being present with someone else's pain. They could say, "I see you're suffering and I'm here, but I'm not going to carry this for you." And that willingness to be compassionate without being consumed, Jung saw this as one of the highest expressions of psychological health. The world doesn't always reward this kind of health. People who've known you as the endlessly giving version may never fully accept the new one. Some relationships will end permanently. Some family dynamics will become strained in ways that don't resolve. The cost of focusing on yourself is real, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. You will lose things. You will lose people. And some of those losses will hurt in places you didn't know you could be hurt. But here's what you gain. You gain a life that actually belongs to you. You gain the experience of making a decision because it's right for you, not because someone else needs it. You gain mornings where you wake up and the first thing you think about isn't someone else's crisis. You gain the slow, strange, unfamiliar pleasure of discovering what you actually enjoy, what you're actually interested in, what you actually want from your remaining years on this planet. Jung believed this was the entire point of psychological development. He saw individuation, this process of becoming fully yourself, as the central task of human life. And he observed that most people never undertake it because the cost seems too high. They stay oriented outward, stay focused on others, stay in the comfortable role of the giver, the helper, the one who holds it all together. And they die without ever knowing who they would have been if they'd turned inward long enough to find out. That's the real tragedy Jung kept returning to. Not suffering, not conflict, not even loss. The real tragedy is the unlived life, the self that was never explored, the potential that was never actualized, the person you were meant to become who never got the chance because you were too busy being what everyone else needed you to be. If you're in the middle of this right now, the guilt, the emptiness, the strange disorientation of a life reorganizing itself around your own needs for the first time, know that the discomfort is supposed to be there. It means the old structure is breaking down. It means the room you abandoned years ago is being opened, aired out, made habitable again. What grows in that space will take time. It will be unfamiliar at first, but it will be yours in a way nothing has been before. Focusing on yourself after a lifetime of focusing on everyone else feels like learning to breathe with a different set of lungs. Everything is awkward. The rhythm is wrong. You keep reaching for the old pattern because it was automatic, and this new thing requires conscious effort every single day. But the effort builds something. Slowly, unevenly, with setbacks and doubts and days where you almost go back. It builds a life with you in it. Jung would tell you that this is the work, the real work. Everything else, the people-pleasing, the caretaking, the constant outward orientation, was preparation for the moment when you'd finally have the courage to turn around and face your own life. And facing it, with all its emptiness and anger and unexplored possibility, is the bravest thing a person can do. The room is still there, it's been waiting, and the silence inside it, the one that frightened you at the beginning, it starts to sound different the longer you stay. Less like emptiness, more like space. The kind of space where something real can finally begin. If any of this has landed somewhere that matters, and you want a way to continue this inward work with intention, our True Self-Discovery Guide was created for exactly this kind of turning point. 24 reflection exercises drawn from Jung's teachings, designed to help you navigate the space you finally allowed yourself to enter. Click below to get True Self-Discovery.